unlicensed developers, unauthorized sequels, and one of the most enduring games of all time. Same name, different game, Ms. Pac-Man. Hello once again, friends, and welcome back to Same Name, Different Game, as we continue the Nintendo Entertainment Celebration, looking at only games for the NES and the Famicom in honor of the Nintendo Entertainment System's 30th birthday. We are looking at a unique case this month. We're looking at two versions of the same game for the same system by completely different publishers and completely different developers. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, because we're getting started not with a little history, but with a lot of history about Namco, Bally Midway, the General Computer Corporation, Tengen, Nintendo, and Ms. Pac-Man. Our story really begins in 1955 when Masaya Nakamura started a business placing electromechanical amusements in Japanese department stores. He called it Nakamura Manufacturing, later changing the name to Nakamura Amusement Machine Manufacturing Company, or Namco. Fast forward to the 1970s. Atari Japan is being run by a man named Hide Nakajima, but it isn't flourishing as well as Atari founder Nolan Bushnell has hoped. So they sell the branch and all its debts to Masaya Nakamura for $500,000 and a 10-year contract to place Atari games in Japan. Now, Nakamura kept Hide Nakajima on board in a leadership role, and in 1978, Namco released their first in-house developed video game, GB, developed by Toru Iwatani. Namco would go on to be the first company to release a full-color video game with Galaxian in 1979, but their greatest success would come in 1980, when Iwatani would create a game about a yellow circle who loved to eat. In the interest of keeping this episode somewhat brief, let's nutshell this part by saying that Pac-Man was a massive success, but you all knew that, right? Meanwhile, in Boston, MIT students Doug McRae and Kevin Curran were running a coin route that had been passed down from earlier students. They had pinball and video games in various locations around the campus and would maintain them and collect money to make spare cash while in school. Being the enterprising young lads that they were, they realized that one of the games on their route, Missile Command, had started bringing in less money, and they devised a solution. Being MIT students and therefore technologically inclined, they created an add-on kit for Missile Command to make it Super Missile Attack, a harder version of the game. They incorporated as the General Computer Corporation and sold the add-on board in the back of amusement magazines and catalogs. The increased difficulty brought interest up and average playtime down, leading to increased revenue. They sold a ton of these boards, making hundreds of thousands of dollars while still students at MIT. They then realized that Pac-Man had some pretty serious shortcomings, and set to work on correcting those. The original Pac-Man has only one maze, and the monsters move in preset patterns, so what this means is that theoretically a skilled player can continue playing until they reach the kill screen, or until they get bored, or at least for a good long while. The solution was twofold. First, make more mazes. Then, adjust the behavior of the monsters so there was no pattern. With these solutions in mind, as well as some other adjustments like more warp tunnels and moving the bonus fruit around the maze, GCC created Crazy Auto, a mod of Pac-Man featuring a little yellow dude with feet and some oddly shaped monsters. It looked like some kind of weird Muppet game, to be honest. At any rate, there was a problem. In the intervening time, Atari had sued them for Super Missile Attack,
and they'd settled out of court. Part of their settlement was that they could no longer create unauthorized enhancement kits for games. So, what to do with Crazy Otto? Well, if you're GCC, you go to Chicago and have a meeting with Bally Midway, the US distributors of Pac-Man, and bluff to them that you backed Atari down, since the details of your settlement are not public knowledge, and you get them to pay you for Crazy Otto. Of course, Bally Midway had some notes and certainly wanted to keep their branding on point, so the character of Crazy Otto was out and Ms. Pac-Man was in. But the end result is that they bought the kit and manufactured the cabinets.
Ms. Pac-Man went on to be one of the best-selling and highest-grossing arcade machines of all time. I might also add, on a personal note, that it is my favorite classic arcade game and one of my favorite games overall. In fact, when I was young, my dad bought a Ms. Pac-Man cabinet and it was in our house for many years during my youth.
Ms. Pac-Man has been ported to nearly every computer, console, and handheld under the sun. From the Atari 2600 done by General Computer Corporation themselves, all the way up through current Android and iOS devices. This is kind of weird, as while Namco has no problem profiting off the game, they seem to disavow it in other weird ways, such as not listing it in their official company history or in their archival material. Since it was released by Bally Midway, they seem to be oddly upset about it despite its success, and the story goes that Midway's continuing iterations on the Pac family eventually led to the dissolution of the relationship between Namco and Bally Midway. General Computer Corporation would go on to work as an Atari second party for several years as part of the lawsuit settlement. They would also design the hardware for the Atari 7800, which would languish in warehouses for years before going to market, thanks to the leadership of then Atari owner Jack Tramiel. By the time the Atari 7800 hit the market, the NES was already entrenched, and quite frankly the 7800 didn't stand a chance. In the interim, Atari had split, with Tramiel buying the consumer division from Time Warner in 1984, which would be known as Atari Corporation. The arcade division was dubbed Atari Games and could not use the name Atari for any home ports or home products it might decide to release later on. In 1985, Time Warner offloaded controlling shares of Atari Games to Namco, believe it or not, but in 1986 Namco decided they didn't want to deal with it, so they in turn sold their shares to a group of Atari Games employees and our old friend Hide Nakajima, who'd been in a leadership role at Namco. He left Namco to run Atari Games. This did not, however, completely sour their relationship, as you will soon see.
And now we see the beginnings of one of the biggest conflicts in video game history.
Atari Games could not sell home products of any kind as Atari, so they created an imprint brand called Tengen. Tengen became a Nintendo licensee in 1988, putting out 3 games: Pac-Man, Gauntlet, and RBI Baseball. Of those, 2 were games that Namco had released on the Famicom in Pac-Man and RBI Baseball. But Tengen wasn't happy with the restrictive licensing agreements put forth by Nintendo of America. They could only publish 5 games a year, and they had to be exclusive to the NES for 2 years. And on top of that, they had to pay Nintendo to manufacture the cartridges rather than manufacturing them themselves. Later in 1988, the industry-wide chip shortage proved to be the final straw. With orders unfulfilled by Nintendo, Tengen went unlicensed and started releasing their own cartridges, at the same time suing Nintendo for unfair business practices.
But how did they make these unlicensed cartridges, I can hear you asking? Well, by sending one of their attorneys to the patent office to claim that they were engaged in a copyright suit over the NES lockout chip technology, thereby gaining a copy of the patent. The problem with this is they were not actually engaged in such a lawsuit, and that is very illegal and totally not okay. But this wouldn't be discovered for some time, and the lawsuit between Tengen and Nintendo would go on for several years, so we'll come back and finish this part of the story next time.
In the meantime, injunctions failed and Atari Games continued to release unlicensed NES games, and continued to have a relationship with Namco, who would not start publishing NES games in the US themselves until 1993. By this time, Namco had reasserted their rights to Ms. Pac-Man, taking them from Midway and General Computer Corporation, although the exact story on how this happened and how they asserted those rights is in dispute and varies depending on who you ask.
And so finally we get to our first game for this episode, Ms. Pac-Man by Tengen, published in 1990. This game was developed by Franz Lanzinger, who ported the game himself. He didn't have access to the source code though, because I assume Namco didn't have it since it was created by General Computer Corporation and not Namco. In a 2010 interview with Frank Cifaldi on the podcast Retronauts, Lanzinger explained his process for making this game. Let's take a listen.
So I did a Miss Pac-Man for the NES at Tengen. That was my project after Tubin. And I did that one solo in 4 months.
Wow.
So, and that was an amazing project because basically they gave me a Miss Pac-Man arcade cabinet, and they gave me a pause button. So I could, it was an arcade, they modified the hardware so I could pause it so I could see what was going on, right? But I had no access to the source code. So I had to reverse engineer the entire game.
Why was that?
Yeah, why don't they give you the source code if you're porting the
Because it wasn't accessible. We didn't have access to the source code. It was we basically had a letter from Namco saying, yes, you may do a version. That's it.
So if I'm remembering Miss Pac-Man correctly, it scrolled, right? The entire playthrough.
Well, the original arcade game did not scroll.
Right, of course.
It was fixed. But we couldn't fit to the graphics on there. So Tengen published Pac-Man.
Right.
And the way that Pac-Man was done is they shrunk the graphics. So you lost some resolution, didn't look quite as good.
Yeah, and that version I think was just taken from Japan.
That was developed in Japan, yes.
Yeah.
So then I thought it might be okay to do scrolling. So that was an engineering decision to do the original arcade graphics without change. Mm-hmm. But then you'd have to scroll so you could fit it. So it was a trade-off basically. But I was able to do the exact original arcade graphics by looking at each pixel manually.
Redrawing it.
And redrawing it, yeah.
Did you have like graph paper next to you?
Yeah, that's exactly how I did. But it didn't take that long because there's not that much graphics in it. But even those animations that you see, like the stork flying, and that was all done by me by hand, pixel by pixel.
Oh yeah, pause it,
draw it, pause it, yeah.
I like that version you did. It's a good game. I like it.
And then we added a whole bunch of stuff, new levels and multiplayer.
Speed boost. There's a speed boost. Remember that?
This port features a total of 32 mazes divided into subsets. The original 4 arcade mazes, of course, but then there are mini, big, and strange sets as well. The mini set are essentially smaller versions of the arcade mazes made to fit a standard TV, as the arcade game used a vertically oriented monitor. The big mazes are extra large, becoming oddly easy, as the monsters are distributed so far across the mazes that it's hard for them to effectively corner you. My favorite addition, though, are the strange mazes, which are just, well, strange. My personal favorite is this one. It's like a billboard for Tengen. Just check it out. I mean, I guess they really wanted you to play Clax. These mazes also add new bonus fruit, or, well, not fruit, but like milk and ice cream and the Clax hand? Man, they really did want you to play Clax when you were done with this game.
Hey, it was the 90s, and there was time for Clax.
This game also adds a speed boost for Ms. Pac-Man, which you can set to a button or just turn on all the time. The arcade game required a kit to do this, and as near as I can tell, only the versions based on this port feature the option outside of the arcade. It also features the option to start on any of the first 7 stages of any set of mazes, and provides 3 continues once you get to stage 8 or beyond. Possibly the biggest and weirdest addition here, though, is 2-player simultaneous play. You can play co-op or competitive, with the difference being that if one player eats an Energizer during competitive play, the other player loses the ability to eat anything until the Energizer's effect is over, or they pick up an Energizer of their own.
This version of Ms. Pac-Man is a great home port, and as far as ports made directly for home systems and not just emulations, I would say that this is arguably the best version, although the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions, which use Franz Lanzinger's NES port as a basis, are also very good. Still, in 1993, Namco quietly started publishing games in the NES themselves, probably due to the ongoing litigation between Tengen and Nintendo. And so, at that time, they published this, Ms. Pac-Man. Now, think about this for a moment. It's 1993. The Super NES has been out for 2 years in the US. The Genesis has been out for 4 years in the US. The arcade is back on the upswing thanks to games like Street Fighter and other titles. And Namco decides to publish a port of a 11, 12-year-old arcade game. And what's weird about this is that unlike their port of Pac-Man, which also came out in 1993, this one was rebuilt from the ground up. Yes, the port that Namco Home Tech published of Pac-Man in 1993 was just a new wrapper on the previous Tengen versions, which in turn were just versions of the original Pac-Man port that Namco had done themselves on the Famicom in 1984. But this Ms. Pac-Man? Not the case.
This version of Ms. Pac-Man is more or less a straight-up arcade port. It puts a big black status bar on the right, which shrinks the maze down so it can fit on one screen, but some of the visual fidelity is lost, which is why I prefer the Tengen version even if it does scroll. It also doesn't contain any of the bells and whistles that Franz Lanzinger added to his port. The extra maze sets are all gone, the 2-player is gone, the speed boost is gone, the continues are gone. There are 4 new mazes, but they're not in a separate set. They're just added to the regular rotation, and to see even one of them, you have to make it through 16 stages. To see them all, you need to clear over 20 stages. And to boot, this is considered by many to be the hardest version of Ms. Pac-Man.
It still strikes me as incredibly odd that Namco would release this game in 1993, but they did, and here we are, so let's take a look and a listen side by side. And that makes it time to give the edge, and it is, without question, the Tengen version. Franz Lanzinger did great stuff with this version of the game, stuff that hasn't been seen in any of the other ports except for the ones based on this one. So check it out. Even though the arcade original is definitely the ultimate version of Ms. Pac-Man, this one is a close second, and you can get it for about 20 bucks. And you can get the Genesis version for even cheaper than that. So that does it for this episode of Same Name Different Game, but come back next month for another history-heavy installment as we finish the story of Tengen and look at one of the most interesting international sagas in the history of video games. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you then.